you're drawing on these people, when you're drawing on people's time, it's rare when you're able to invite them back. And we did, and they came. So I just really want to say thank you to everyone who will be helping us lead this conversation. I know you have lots to do. And I do also want to acknowledge Margaret Pierce, my old colleague and cartographer. I am a geographer by training, who was such an important part of this team as well, although she's not here with us. Our primary goal today is to learn from each other. It's basically continuing conversations about topics that I think all of us are engaged in. I hope everyone's going to feel comfortable having a pretty open and honest dialogue as we think about next steps. And to just position this a little bit, and I think Jesse will probably do a better job of this, for the last 8 years, we wanted to get from a context where the university failed to acknowledge its history, and though it has amazing American Indian Studies programs and other engagements at the faculty level with sovereign Native nations in the state we now call Wisconsin, but elsewhere, it still was clear that this university was not doing what it needed to do. And the university is working hard to do the things it needs to do. So this is just one step and one piece of this, but it's an important piece. And I think we were all inspired by the LandGrabU project. It was, you know, I can't even describe it. You see it and you're struck dumb in a sense. You can't speak. So I just want to say thanks to the authors. Thanks for coming. Thanks to all of the people at UW who are working on these topics. I'm going to turn it over to Jesse Conaway, who spearheaded organizing this workshop. Jesse's faculty associate for Native Nations Partnerships here in the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, and the Indigenous Arts and Sciences lead researcher with Earth Partnerships. And she co-chaired the Native Nations UW Working Group over the past several years. And that has grown now to a campus-wide effort and with participation at the very highest levels, all the way up to sort of central administration, which is the step in the right direction. So Jesse, please take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Robbins, and thank you to the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies for hosting and funding this workshop. My name is Dr. Jesse Conaway. I'm Scots-Irish from the East Coast. I'm an ally to Indian people. I've been working in Indian country since I moved to Wisconsin in the mid-90s. I'm very honored to be here and also at this stage in our work. This is a big step. I want to welcome in each of our participants. Welcome to the LandGrabU project team, and a special welcome to elected officials and representatives of the Native nations in Wisconsin who are joining in here with us today. Also welcome to extension participants and new colleagues from Ohio State University who are also joining us. I appreciate each of you being here for this challenging and crucial work. Honoring folks of diverse cultural backgrounds. This afternoon, I'd like to recommend, suggest, request that we take a moment of silence as a group to set our intentions and get going in a good way. So please take a moment of silence. LandGrabU in Dejo participants, please join me in acknowledging that the University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejo since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state governments repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. This statement is not our formal land acknowledgement as an institution. We're still working on that, but we use this. This is part of a heritage marker that was worked on by members of the Native Nations UW Working Group together with Ho-Chunk Nation over 4 years. And so some of us currently use that as our land acknowledgement, but we're still working on a formal statement. And that's our work today will inform that. Finally, I'd like to thank the Tribal Advisory Council and also my Native mentors for advising this work and for helping me to prepare for this workshop. With land acknowledgement, the onus of the work is on UW-Madison and UW system, but it's been guided by our connections to the Native nations in Wisconsin. LandGrabU is a call to action, and over the last 5 years, UW-Madison has assembled and convened institutional infrastructure together with Native nations to be able to respond to this work. We want to craft a response and make recommendations to our leadership, and we're well positioned to do so. The recently finalized Native Nations UW initiative for phase 2 includes an objective for land acknowledgement, and I'll put that in the chat here in a second so you can see that objective. Many are working in this area or wanting to, and we're together here today, many of us. The LandGrabU project will catalyze our movement, which has already begun, into education and action around land acknowledgement of our history as an institution, our obligations to Native nations, and to ongoing stewardship of land and waters in Wisconsin. Welcome in. That being said, bring it in, people. Let's get to work. I'm going to turn it over to James Flores, a new colleague. Really excited about having James here with us today. James is a member of the Oneida Nation, and he works in admissions at UW-Madison. James Flores, good to see you. Welcome in, and turning over the mic to you to introduce our speakers.
Thanks for that introduction, Jesse. I appreciate that. As Jesse said, I'm James Flores. I come from the Oneida Nation, and I'm the admissions counselor here at UW-Madison for Native American Outreach and Recruitment. And today I got the pleasure of introducing our distinguished speakers today. First, I'd like to introduce Tristan Antone, a member of the Kiowa tribe, and is the editor-in-chief in the Texas Observer. He has reported for multiple outlets, including PBS NewsHour, National Native News, NPR, Al Jazeera America, and High Country News, where he served as Indigenous Affairs editor. Tristan's stories have won multiple honors, including investigative awards from Public Radio News Directors Incorporated and the Gannett Foundation. He additionally was awarded a Nieman Fellowship to study at Harvard University in 2017. Tristan is a director of the Muck Rock Foundation and is the former president of the Native American Journalists Association. Next, we have Robert Lee, who is a lecturer in American history and a fellow of Silan College at the University of Cambridge. His research focuses on indigenous disposition and U.S. state formation in the 19th century American West. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks to James, to Jesse, and to Paul for those introductions, and to all of you for being here. It's our second time at Wisconsin, well, virtually at Wisconsin, to talk about land grab universities. And what's particularly exciting about this visit is that we get to do something that we normally haven't gotten a chance to do, which is to really have a workshop and to have a conversation about the issues that are raised by the research here. So we'd like to start by asking everyone who's come today to, as we sort of give our 25-30 minute overview of the project, to think about potential questions you might have, to think about potential uses that you might have for this type of work to be helpful or generative for whatever goals you may have, some of the issues that Jesse is outlining, so that we can talk about them after the talk, to think about, how this research can be put into actionable terms, in terms of restorative justice, in terms of curricular or educational efforts, or in terms of thinking about, writing or revising land acknowledgements. So with that, I'll let Tristan kick it off here.
Yeah, I'd like to echo Dr. Lee in saying thank you for the invitation to return, and thanks to everyone at UW for pulling this together. During this presentation, we'll talk about the story, LandGrabUorg, give background on the Morrill Act, show you how to access and use the data we collected, and talk about the many ways in which journalists and institutions have begun to engage with this investigation. So in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Act, and that distributed public domain lands to raise funds for fledgling colleges across the nation. The story that we've heard around the Morrill Act is that land-grant universities were given the gift of free land to bring education to the masses. But as our investigation reveals, the Morrill Act worked by turning land expropriated from indigenous communities into seed money for higher education. In all, the Act redistributed nearly 10.8 million acres of land for more than 250 nations for the benefit of 52 colleges. But the Morrill Act's footprint is broken up into almost 80,000 parcels of land scattered across 24 different states, making research and reporting on its impacts nearly impossible. However, through our 2-year investigation, we've been able to identify and map those 80,000 individual land parcels. And combined, that land represents an area approximately the size of Denmark. And our reporting really provides a window into how universities profited from dispossession and genocide. But it also offers opportunities for additional reporting, research, and collaboration to further the investigative work that this project has kicked off. So we'll discuss that in more detail in a moment, but first, Dr. Lee will talk a bit more about the Morrill Act and how this project came to be.
Yeah, thanks, Tristan. So what I'd like to do is give you some background on the project and provide some additional detail about the Morrill Act of 1862 and our approach to researching it. Do you want to go to the next slide there, Tristan, please?
Sure.
So the indigenous sources of university land has been a really major emerging issue, really only in the last sort of 5 years or so. And it really came out of the emerging studies of slavery in the university that I'm sure many of you have seen. I'm not going to go into a long historiographical background, but I think a great place to start on this is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book from 2014, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, where she flagged the issue of the Morrill Act and its relationship to indigenous land. There have been other writers, Kay Wayne Yang, Sharon Stein, who we interviewed for the piece. There have even been some efforts to map Morrill Act parcels associated with particular universities, both in terms of efforts of tying them to their original indigenous sources and efforts that were sort of purely disconnected from that history, and thinking in terms of the sort of the celebratory mode that I'm sure many of you, working at a land-grant university have encountered in the course of your work. And Morrill Halls, statues of Abraham Lincoln. I know there's one at Wisconsin. All of these types of murals, statues, celebrations of the Morrill Act. And it's really only in the last couple of years that some people have started to question the conventional picture of the Morrill Act as a sort of a font of democratization of education in the United States. So it's really an exciting time to be thinking about what had been until recently just entirely neglected issue in both the scholarship and the memory of land-grant universities. Now, where did the High Country News collaboration sort of come into this emerging work? We started in 2018. Tristan and I were both on fellowships at the same university. I mean, this was really fortunate. Now I'm a historian, he's a journalist. We don't really run in the same circles normally. And the project's aim, its goal, was to try to unspool the Morrill Act knot completely, to not just identify the parcels that were connected with one state or one university or one indigenous nation, but to look at it as a whole, to identify all of them as insofar as that was possible, to track down the indigenous origins of every single parcel. And the idea was to try to gain a sense of the enormity of the wealth transfer that the Morrill Act enabled and entailed. The map that you were looking at a moment ago is made by Margaret Pierce, the cartographer for the project. So is this infographic that you're looking at here. And that last map really sort of condenses our findings in their most sort of singular form. But before I get into the details of it, let me tell you a little bit about the sort of Morrill Act itself. So the Morrill Act is passed in 1862. It creates a national land-grant university system. This isn't to say that there hadn't been land-grant universities before that. You can find them, supported by the federal government into the early 19th century, where land is being distributed for the foundation of colleges. It's really in the mid-19th century at places like Michigan State and Penn State that you have the sort of model emerge that the Morrill Act of 1862 is picking up on and nationalizing. In the literature on land-grant colleges, you often see the phrase sort of democracy's colleges, often with a question mark after it. That's sort of the question that's been in the center of it. To what extent did the Morrill Act open up educational possibilities for the agrarian and industrial classes of America? To what extent did it realize this ambition to democratize higher education in the United States? It comes at a time in the Civil War in 1862 when you have three of the iconic land laws. There are thousands of land laws that are passed by the United States in the 19th century, but three of the big ones all come in 1862. That's the Homestead Act. That's followed shortly thereafter by the Pacific Railroad Act that creates these sort of checkerboard pattern grants across the continent, and that's followed quickly thereafter by the Morrill Act of 1862. And what the Morrill Act does is it gives away about 10.8 million acres eventually to 47 states, which go on to sell or lease this land, and they funnel the proceeds into endowments for 52, we found, universities that are supported by the Morrill Act of 1862. Most of these universities are public, like the University of Wisconsin. Some are private, like MIT or Cornell. This land, we found, came from nearly 250 different tribes and nations whose land was claimed by the US through 162 different treaties, ratified, unratified, or various land takings, uncompensated land takings. And when you look at how much was paid, it was roughly $400,000 to indigenous nations for what was called Indian title in the 18th, 19th, 20th century. Although I should add that for many of these transactions, nothing was paid at all. This was the case, for example, in California. And off of these acquisitions, the Morrill Act is able to produce $23 million in principal. And that's a ratio of about 57 to 1. It means for every $1 that the United States pays to extinguish indigenous title, it's able to put $57 in principal into university coffers. And when you take a look at how that sort of compares to dollar values today, it's about $500 million. $500 million in 2020 dollars is how much it raised before any of that money was sort of put to work earning interest, right? And what you see in sort of the map that Margaret Pierce made for the article, if you've read it, is this sort of 80,000 parcels across 24 states that are being that comprise this 10.7 million acres. And what you're looking at here is an infographic also made by Margaret Pierce, showing the sort of step-by-step guide of how the Morrill Act of 1862 sort of works. You know, first, Congress makes the offer of to states for land for universities. Next, some of this land had been acquired already from indigenous nations. Some is going to be acquired in the future. The third point here is about the size of the grants. They varied considerably from 90,000 to 990,000 acres, depending on the size of a state's congressional delegation. This fourth point here is a description between how the land was distributed, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. And the last step here is the disposal of the land. This land was either sold typically to speculators, or the scrip was sold to speculators. And sometimes the land was sort of held and sold over time by the university. Sometimes it was held on to for years. Some of it is held on to even today. If we go to the next slide, we can take a closer look at that point 4 there and see the sort of different ways in which the Morrill Act was administered, depending on what kind of state you came from. If you were in a Western state, like California, you see here, you had to choose land from within the boundaries of the state. This is also the case, I believe, with Wisconsin. If you were from an Eastern state like New York, you see Cornell here on the slide. They were given scrip to select land from anywhere on the public domain of the United States. So that's why you see Cornell's connections to all over outside of New York here. If we go to the next slide, you'll get a look at sort of how this worked on the ground. Here is an area in Tucson. The photo here is by Kaylin Goodluck, who's a photographer for the piece. The graphics again by Margaret Pierce. And what you see here is a square mile that was seized from the Apache in 1886. Went to the benefit of the University of Arizona. In the middle, it's sort of zoomed in over a satellite view, and then if you go on the ground, you see the Apache Tears Motel here. This is one of many photos that Kaylin took for the story. He went on a long road trip using the GPS coordinates of the parcels to see what was really on the ground here. Now, I think we should go to the next slide, and Tristan is going to tell you about the website that we put together for the project.
Yeah, I'll just go briefly through this. I think we covered this maybe last time we were here as well, but obviously want to make sure that for folks that are just jumping into this, you're sort of aware of the assets that are available to you. One of the things that we wanted to do was make this data available to anybody, especially for folks that aren't comfortable using spreadsheets or heavy data users. That's why we came up with LandGrabUorg here. And at the website, you have access to the same data that we do with the same level of accuracy. And you can explore it all essentially through interactive maps. So for instance, when we're looking at University of California, it gives you a lot of information, founding date, student enrollment, how many acres it received, a lot of sort of data that you need to sort of get a sense of the university as it stands now and its connections. But then obviously you can also play with the map that we put together. So Jeff McGee and Cody Leff developed this site, and these maps really allow you to look at all of the connections between an institution and the land. So you can zoom in, you can get really detailed all the way down to the acre. You can fly through, even locate yourself on the map. Those crosshairs on the side there allow the website to locate you and find out if you live next to one of these parcels or even on one of these parcels, as our developer Jeff McGee found out during the reporting process. You can also have the opportunity to check addresses. So that search function there at the bottom right of the screen allows you to check an address and see if it's on a parcel or even what land session it's in. So there's really a ton of information here to play with, allows you to explore and construct sort of your own narratives. And really allows you to go in and click on state boundaries, university links, indigenous land sessions, etc. Just really a large amount of information. The other thing you'll also see is that for universities, we've provided if they responded with a statement when we asked for comment. One other thing that you can do here, as soon as PowerPoint plays along, is in terms of looking at all the connections and zooming out, what's actually happening here on the back end of this website is that each one of those connections for each university essentially goes to its own web page. So Jeff McGee and Cody have basically built around 80,000 different web pages for every single parcel of land on the website. So for instance, if you want to zoom in on California, this is Los Angeles right here. You can see all of the parcels. You can click on each one of those segmented sections, which is one of the parcels to give you more information. So you can click on one of these, see very quickly how many acres, when it was acquired, how much was paid, who the treaty co-signers were, you know, all of the sort of like nitty gritties you need to take a look at this particular parcel. But again, also because you locate yourself on these, you can actually go there. And this is what Bobby described that Kalen Goodluck was doing. So when he went to this particular parcel and to see what was actually there, figured out that it was the Directors Guild of America. This is how we went about for all of the photos and the story as well. So we've got, you know, you can see that there's residences in Los Angeles. You can see the Fort Lawton Post Cemetery in Seattle, Washington, which was Duwamish and Suquamish land that went to Clemson and South Carolina State University. The splash page you saw earlier, the cornfields in Nebraska that were Kaw Nation land that went to Ohio State, as well as El Rosa, Minnesota, looking at the junkyard that's there now on this particular land session. So we also had a follow-up story that we did, I guess, in fall of last year as well, looking at the at least 16 land-grant universities, which were nearly a third of the schools in the system, that still retain more than 500,000 acres of land. And those brought in at least $8.7 million in revenue combined just in fiscal year 2019 alone. You'll see here that Wisconsin is one of those schools and is still in possession of 6,400 mineral acres. In fiscal year 19, those mineral acres didn't produce any revenue for the institution, but we only collected financial data for fiscal year 19. So it's unclear what they produced in the past, if anything at all. May also provide you opportunities to dig a little bit deeper into those assets. And of course, that data and all the stories data is available to download on GitHub.
Yeah, so the data for the piece. So I mean, if the story is sort of the shiny exterior and the website is the sort of steering wheel, the data for the piece is the engine, right? It's probably the least exciting to interact with, you know, a place like GitHub here, but especially for those thinking about how to make this material actionable. Being able to download all of the original data for yourself, to sort through it, to find what you need to make your own visualizations, having access to the original data, which is what we provide here on GitHub, can be really empowering for localizing the material. That, of course, I mean, this was a 5,000 word magazine story. We couldn't talk about everything there. The website lets you interact with the material. It's great for teaching, you know, thinking about how to use this in a course setting. But for doing research and for pulling your own statistics that could be useful for your own projects, there's no substitute for having access to the data itself. There are the shape files to map this material, but there's also tabular data, basically Excel spreadsheets that you can open up here. And there is also, importantly, a user guide. I think it's on the next slide here, sort of in plain language about everything that is contained in the database, what all of the rows and all of the columns describe. This material can be really, I think, useful. We've started to see, we can talk about this a little bit later, but we've started to see people use this data to do their own research, to write land acknowledgements. It's a really important component of the overall project. And if you go on the next slide, you can just see what it looks like. I mean, these are, for the most part, even if you're not super tech savvy and you've never worked with GIS before, Excel spreadsheets are just, it's just sort of on steroids. This is a regular Excel spreadsheet with 80,000 rows, basically, with all of the information that we collected. And there's multiple ones of these. There's also summary tables that you can look at. As well. But let me turn it back over to Tristan, and we can start to talk a little bit about how people have been using this material.
Yeah, to that point, the stories really started a public conversation on the debts universities owe to indigenous communities. And we really think that this conversation is going to continue long into the future. And there are a number of ways in which we've seen researchers and reporters engage in the work. And each is really unique to the institution and community. I'll start with the journalism that we're seeing. There have been three areas we've seen reporters engage in when it comes to taking on this story. And I think we can kind of group them as like localizing, contextualizing, and adapting. So for instance, the investigative news outlet Ion Ohio here mapped all of the lands that supported Ohio schools, more than 614,000 acres spread out over 14 states. And they use the available data that we just showed to you. The US paid about $35,000 for that land, and land sales raised about $340,000, creating a return nearly 10 times the purchase amount. And again, when adjusted for inflation, the US would have paid about $1 million for that land, and the university would have raised $6.8 million off of that land. So it's a really great example of how reporters in one state could pull down the data and could provide detailed, localized analysis of that information for their readers. Then there was Vox Magazine, which is produced by journalism students at the University of Missouri. And Vox looks specifically at Mizzou's footprint and relationship with the indigenous communities it received land from, which are the Osage. So using some just very simple timelines, reporters could add context to the data, and they were able to reveal that through miscommunication or deceptive practices, the Osage ceded all of their land to the federal government and were forced to move to Oklahoma, making that land available to the University of Missouri. Finally, the story that goes beyond the data we collected, but instead sort of utilizes Dr. Lee's methodology, was here in Scalawag Magazine. So in September of last year, Scalawag also revealed that Southern universities funded their early years through the sale of land expropriated from indigenous communities outside of the Morrill Act. So the University of North Carolina, of which you can see on this map, took more than 200,000 acres of Cherokee and Chickasaw lands that were gained through indigenous removal. Scalawag also found that more than 30% of UNC's annual budget was comprised of land sales between 1818 and 1840, well before the Morrill Act became law. So it's a really great adaptation of the work that dives even deeper into this practice, and I think offers some really great blueprints for additional research and reporting that pushes even further past our data that we've collected. In terms of institutional change, we're starting to see some movement in response to the reporting, and I'll let Bobby talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'll just mention about that Scalawag piece because it relates to, I think, what we're here to talk about today, is that was written and researched by a graduate student and a postdoc who had heard about the research and implemented the methodology. So if we're thinking about, what is the relationship between journalism and academia, with this project. There's a lot of space for folks at universities to be thinking creatively about how to make use of this material, and that's what we've been seeing. One of the things that we saw over the summer after we published, if we go to the next slide, was a resolution at the University of Florida. A couple of months after we published, students there at the Student Senate demanded the Assembly form a working group to examine UF's connections to indigenous expropriation and slavery as well, in order to better understand and document the university's history, right? Which is one of the things that can be, that this piece can be serve as a springboard to. There's also been last fall, there was a petition at Cornell University. I can drop a link into that afterwards into the chat. There has been similar demands made at MIT through the architecture program there, drawing on the research to think about how resources and priorities can be discussed within the university using the material. We saw the piece used for a read-in at the Endowment Justice Group at Yale University as well. If we go to the next slide, we can take a look at an example of a land acknowledgement. Washington State University, Pullman, has sort of taken the lead in rewriting its land acknowledgement using data from the piece, from the material that we were looking at earlier, the downloadable data. You can pull that, and they've incorporated that into their land acknowledgement. That's also something we can talk about a little bit later. There's also, if we go to the next slide, the University of California last fall organized a conference to think about what should be next steps. So at UC Berkeley, they had this 2-day symposium to explore and address the university's responsibility to indigenous communities in California. There were nearly 24 speakers at these events. There were breakout sessions dealing with sort of calls to actions, inspiration for accountability, thinking about how to analyze possibilities for land return and its possible mechanics. Just this week, I saw a notice about the Association of American Geographers. There was a panel there by a group of people at different land grant universities who are all responding to this story and trying to sort of create a network to think about, what are the next steps in research on land grant universities' relationships to indigenous land. There's also been a number of initiatives emerging at schools, and I'll let Tristan talk more about that.
Yeah, so at Cornell, the largest More-alike beneficiary, staff and faculty launched a project to document the university's financial windfall. And they regularly update and dedicate space to this site. The goal is to present as much factual information about Cornell's parcels and to determine and consult with tribes impacted by Cornell to determine possible remedies. As well, too, we mentioned earlier at Ohio, there's a similar initiative underway. In this case, Ohio State has announced that it's working in partnership with the First Nations Development Institute to begin conversations with affected tribes and begin to determine an appropriate path forward to develop an understanding of specific reparative actions that would actually benefit indigenous communities. The work is expected to take time, obviously, but does represent one of the, in my opinion, one of the most comprehensive attempts at reconciliation plans taken by a university in regards to impacted communities at this time. And additional initiatives are also ramping up at University of Minnesota, University of Arizona, Utah State, MIT, and University of Connecticut. So those are a handful of some of the major moves we've seen since publication, and each obviously speaks to sort of the unique characteristics of the communities involved. There's definitely no one-size-fits-all approach to the handling of this information or steps, save for one common theme, and it's small groups of individuals interested in seeing this history recognized, acknowledged, and acted on by their institutions. I think I can stop there for the moment. for questions, comments, discussion.
Thank you, LandGrabU project team. One of the best things to come out of 2020, LandGrabU, thank you so much for your work. It's good to hear about this heavy lifting going on in the background to produce a project like this. We would like to invite our participants in. The rest of the day will be